The early morning sun was just beginning to rise over San Francisco International Airport as Sarah Chen Williams pulled up to the private aviation terminal in her Tesla Model S. The clock on her dashboard showed 6:45 a.m., giving her plenty of time before her 7:30 a.m. flight to Seattle. At 42 years old, Sarah had worked incredibly hard to reach her current position as the founder and CEO of SecureNet Solutions, one of the fastest-growing cybersecurity companies in Silicon Valley. Sarah checked her appearance in the rearview mirror, adjusting her navy blue blazer and making sure her hair was neat. She had learned early in her career that as a black woman in tech, she always had to look perfectly put together. Today was especially important as she was heading to Seattle for a meeting with a potential major client who could bring in a $50 million contract for her company. The private terminal was quiet at this hour, with only a few other vehicles parked in the exclusive lot. Sarah grabbed her leather briefcase and carry-on bag from the trunk, her heels clicking against the pavement as she walked toward the entrance. She had made this trip dozens of times before, as flying private had become necessary to manage her growing company's demands and tight schedule. As she approached the glass doors of the terminal, Sarah could see her reflection, a confident, successful businesswoman in a perfectly tailored suit. The morning fog was starting to roll in across the tarmac, and she could see her chartered jet being prepared in the distance. The familiar sight of the sleek Gulfstream G650 brought a small smile to her face, remembering how far she had come from her childhood in a modest Oakland neighborhood. Inside her briefcase were all the necessary documents: her identification, pilot's license — she had earned it 2 years ago as a personal achievement — company credentials, and the flight manifest with her name clearly listed as the primary passenger. Sarah had always believed in being overprepared, a habit that had served her well throughout her career. Through the glass doors, she could see the usual morning crew setting up for the day. Maria Rodriguez, the terminal supervisor who had assisted her many times before, was at the main desk. Captain James Anderson, who had flown her on several previous trips, would be her pilot today. The familiar faces made this terminal feel like a second home to Sarah. What she didn't recognize was the security guard standing at the entrance, a middle-aged white man with graying hair and a stern expression. Thomas Reeves, according to his name tag, was new to her. As Sarah reached for the door handle, she noticed something shift in his posture, a slight straightening of his back and narrowing of his eyes that she had seen too many times before in her life. Sarah took a deep breath, reminding herself of the meeting ahead. In just 3 hours, she would be presenting her company's new security protocol to one of the largest tech companies in the world. She had prepared for weeks, and nothing was going to disturb her focus today. Her hand touched the cool metal of the door handle just as the security guard moved toward the entrance. The morning air was crisp, and the sound of a distant jet taking off echoed across the tarmac. Sarah could smell the familiar scent of jet fuel mixed with the salty Bay Area air. Other passengers were starting to arrive. A white couple in business attire, an older gentleman talking loudly on his phone, all of them walking with the easy confidence of people who never had to prove they belonged. Sarah straightened her shoulders and pulled out her ID, already anticipating what was about to happen. Years of experience had taught her to stay one step ahead, to remain calm and professional no matter what challenges arose. As she pushed open the door, the security guard's expression hardened, and Sarah knew that this morning was about to become more complicated than she had planned. Little did Thomas Reeves know that his actions in the next few minutes would not only prove his own incompetence, but would also spark a chain of events that would lead to significant changes in private aviation security protocols across the country. The moment Sarah stepped through the door, security guard Thomas Reeves moved to block her path. He stood with his feet planted wide, his hand resting on his belt in what he probably thought was an authoritative pose. The morning light streaming through the glass walls cast harsh shadows across his face, making his frown appear even deeper. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, emphasizing the word ma'am in a way that made it sound anything but respectful. "This is a private aviation terminal. The main passenger terminal is in the other direction." His voice carried across the quiet lobby, causing several heads to turn. Sarah remained calm, having dealt with similar situations before. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out her carefully organized documentation. "Good morning, sir. I'm Sarah Chen Williams, and I'm scheduled for the 7:30 a.m. flight to Seattle. Here are my credentials and the flight manifest." Reeves didn't even glance at the documents she held out. Instead, he crossed his arms and looked over her head, as if searching for someone else. There must be some mistake. Are you here to clean the terminal? Or maybe you're looking for the commercial flights? Behind Reeves, Sarah could see Maria Rodriguez at the desk, which just noticed the situation unfolding. The terminal supervisor's eyes widened with recognition, and she began to stand up from her chair. Meanwhile, the white couple Sarah had seen earlier walked right past them, Reeves not even turning his head to check their documentation. "Sir," Sarah said, keeping her voice steady and professional, "I am the CEO of SecuriNet Solutions, and I'm the primary passenger on this flight. If you would just look at my documentation." "Listen," Reeves cut her off, his tone growing more condescending. "I've worked security for 20 years. I know who belongs here and who doesn't. Now, I'm trying to be nice about this, but you need to leave before I have to call for backup." Sarah noticed a young man nearby had taken out his phone and was quietly recording the interaction. She made a mental note of his presence, knowing that documentation was crucial in situations like this. The morning fog outside had grown thicker, making the glass walls feel like they were closing in. "Mr. Reeves," she said, reading his name tag again, "I fly from this terminal regularly. I suggest you check my credentials and the flight manifest, which I'm still holding out for you to verify." She kept her voice calm but firm, years of boardroom negotiations having taught her how to maintain composure under pressure. The security guard's face reddened slightly. He reached for his radio, deliberately ignoring the documents Sarah still held. "Base, this is Reeves. I have a situation at the main entrance. Need backup for a suspicious individual refusing to leave the premises." The absurdity of the situation might have been almost funny if it wasn't so infuriating. Through the glass walls, Sarah could see her chartered jet being fueled, the ground crew going about their normal routine, unaware of the drama unfolding inside. More passengers were entering the terminal now, creating an audience for this unnecessary confrontation. Some walked past quickly, avoiding eye contact, while others slowed down to watch. Sarah noticed how Reeves barely glanced at any of the white passengers, waving them through with a friendly nod. Maria was now quickly walking toward them, her heels clicking against the polished floor. At the same time, 2 more security guards appeared from a side door, responding to Reeves's call for backup. The situation was escalating exactly as Sarah had feared it might. Taking out her phone, Sarah began to record the interaction herself. "I want to be clear about what's happening here," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the now quiet terminal. "I'm being denied entry to a flight I'd booked and paid for, despite having all the proper documentation, which you refused to even look at. Would you like to explain why?" Reeves's face turned a deeper shade of red, but before he could respond, Maria finally reached them, slightly out of breath and looking mortified. The morning sun had fully risen now, streaming through the windows and illuminating the scene like a spotlight on a stage, as if highlighting the absurdity and injustice of the entire situation. Maria Rodriguez rushed forward, her face showing clear distress as she approached Sarah and the confrontational security guard. "Mr. Reeves, this is Ms. Chen Williams. She's one of our regular clients," she explained quickly, her voice carrying across the now silent terminal. But Thomas Reeves wasn't ready to back down. He turned to Maria with a look of dismissal, keeping his body positioned to block Sarah's path. "Ma'am, I'm handling a security situation here. Please return to your desk." His words came out sharp and commanding, revealing his growing frustration. Sarah continued recording with her phone, maintaining her professional composure. The small crowd of onlookers had grown, with several people now openly filming the incident on their phones. Through the terminal's glass walls, the morning fog had lifted, revealing the sleek private jet waiting on the tarmac, Sarah's jet, the one she was supposed to board in less than 30 minutes. "Mr. Reeves," Sarah spoke clearly, making sure her voice would be captured clearly on all the recordings. "I'm going to list out what's happening right now. You've refused to look at my identification, my flight manifest, or my company credentials. You've called backup for a non-existent security threat, and you've just dismissed your supervisor who was trying to confirm my identity." 2 more security guards stood awkwardly to the side, clearly unsure how to handle the situation. One of them, a younger officer named Jenkins according to his name tag, glanced at the documents Sarah was still holding, then at Reeves, his discomfort visible. The white couple who had walked past earlier were now watching from near the coffee station. The woman leaned over to her husband and whispered something, shaking her head in disapproval, not at Sarah, but at Reeves's behavior. "Ma'am," Reeves said, his voice getting louder, "I don't care what kind of documents you're holding. I know every regular client at this terminal, and you're not one of them." He emphasized the word "no" with such certainty that it would have been almost comical if it wasn't so offensive. Maria stepped forward again, this time more assertively. "Mr. Reeves, I need you to listen to me right now. Ms. Chen Williams flies from this terminal at least twice a month. She's the CEO of SecureNet Solutions. Her company's name is literally on our security software system." Several heads turned to look at the security monitoring screens behind the main desk, where the SecureNet Solutions logo was clearly visible in the corner. Reeves faltered for a moment, but quickly recovered his aggressive stance. "If that's true," he said, his voice dripping with skepticism, "then where's her pilot? Where's her flight crew? Anyone can fake documents these days." He reached for Sarah's papers, not to check them, but to prove they were fake. Sarah smoothly pulled the documents back, protecting them from his grasp. "Please don't touch my property," she said firmly. "And to answer your question, Captain James Anderson is my pilot today. He's flown me dozens of times. Would you like to call him to verify?" A businessman waiting nearby spoke up. "I've seen her here before, many times actually. She's usually on the early morning Seattle route." Others in the crowd began nodding in agreement. Reeves's face grew redder with each passing moment. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, his earlier confidence beginning to crack under the weight of mounting evidence and witness statements. But still, he refused to move or acknowledge his mistake. Sarah checked her watch, 7:15 a.m. Her crucial meeting in Seattle was scheduled for 11 o'clock a.m., and this unnecessary delay was threatening to derail her entire day. She took a deep breath and decided to change tactics. "Officer Jenkins," she called to the younger security guard, "would you please check my documentation?" Since Mr. Reeves seems unable to perform this basic part of his job duties, perhaps you can assist. Jenkins stepped forward, looking between Reeves and Sarah. The tension in the terminal had reached a breaking point. Outside, the sound of another private jet taking off reminded everyone that time was passing, and Sarah's own flight schedule was being compromised by this display of prejudice and incompetence. The morning sun now streamed fully through the terminal's windows, illuminating the scene like a spotlight on an unfolding drama, a drama that was about to reach its turning point as Captain Anderson's familiar figure appeared in the terminal doorway. Captain James Anderson's arrival changed the atmosphere in the terminal instantly. He walked in wearing his crisp pilot's uniform, his captain's stripes gleaming under the morning lights. The crowd parted slightly as he approached the tense scene, his presence commanding natural respect. "Sarah," he called out cheerfully, completely unaware of the situation, "I was just coming to tell you we're ahead of schedule. We can take off early if you're ready to." His voice trailed off as he noticed the security guards, the crowd, and the phones recording everything. His smile faded into a look of concern. Reeves's face went through a series of rapid changes, from red to pale and back again. He straightened his uniform and tried to maintain his authority, but his confidence was clearly shaken. "Captain, you know this person?" he asked, his voice slightly higher than before. "Know her?" Captain Anderson looked confused. "Sarah Chen Williams is one of our most valued clients. I've been her pilot for the past 3 years. We're scheduled to fly to Seattle this morning for our company's big presentation." He turned to Sarah with concern. "Is everything all right here?" Before Sarah could answer, Maria stepped forward again. "No, James, everything is not all right. Mr. Reeves here has been refusing to let Ms. Chen Williams through security. You wouldn't even look at her documentation." The young security officer, Jenkins, who had been watching everything unfold, finally found his voice. "Sir," he said to Reeves, "I've checked Ms. Chen Williams's documentation. Everything is in order. Her flight manifest, ID, and credentials are all valid." More people had gathered in the terminal now, including other pilots and flight crew members who knew Sarah. A flight attendant named Rachel came forward. "Sarah, do you want your usual coffee before we take off? I already have it prepared. Almond milk latte with an extra shot." The contrast between the regular staff's familiar treatment of Sarah and Reeves's behavior became starkly obvious to everyone watching. Some passengers had started making phone calls, and the words discrimination and lawsuit could be heard whispered among the crowd. Maria took charge of the situation. "Mr. Reeves, step aside immediately. Ms. Chen Williams needs to board her flight." Her voice was firm and professional, but everyone could hear the anger underneath it. "Jenkins, please escort Ms. Chen Williams to her aircraft. I'll deal with this situation personally." Reeves stood frozen, his authority completely undermined. The reality of his mistake and its potential consequences seemed to finally hit him. I was just following security protocols," he stammered, but his words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Sarah, who had maintained her composure throughout the entire ordeal, finally spoke. "No, Mr. Reeves, you weren't following protocols. You were following your prejudices. The protocol is to check identification and documentation, which you refused to do. Every person in this terminal witnessed that." Captain Anderson placed a supportive hand on Sarah's shoulder. "The plane is ready whenever you are, Sarah. And for the record, I'll be submitting my own incident report about this delay to our flight operations." The crowd began to move, making way for Sarah to pass. As Jenkins stepped forward to escort her, several people approached to offer their contact information as witnesses. The businessman who had spoken up earlier handed Sarah his business card. "I'm an attorney," he said quietly. "What happened here was unacceptable. Please call my office if you need anything." Maria was already on her phone, presumably calling terminal management. Reeves stood to the side, his earlier bravado completely deflated, watching as Sarah finally walked past him toward her waiting aircraft. The morning sun streaming through the windows caught the CEO pin on her lapel, making it shine briefly, a small but fitting reminder of who she was and what she had achieved. Rachel hurried alongside Sarah with the coffee, chatting as if nothing unusual had happened, helping to restore a sense of normalcy. But everyone in the terminal knew they had witnessed something significant, a moment when prejudice and power had been confronted by dignity and truth. As Sarah walked toward her plane, her heels clicking confidently on the terminal floor, the watching crowd understood that this incident wouldn't end here. Change was coming to the private aviation terminal, and Sarah Chen Williams had just become its catalyst. As Sarah walked towards her aircraft with her escort, Maria Rodriguez wasn't finished with the situation. She pulled out an incident report form and began documenting everything that had happened, her pen moving quickly across the paper. The terminal's security cameras had captured the entire scene from multiple angles. "I need statements from everyone who witnessed this," Maria announced to the crowd, her voice clear and professional. Several passengers immediately stepped forward, including the attorney and the young man who had first started recording the incident on his phone. Thomas Reeves stood awkwardly to the side, his security badge now clutched in Maria's other hand. The terminal's head of security, David Thompson, had arrived after receiving an urgent call. He was a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and a serious expression that grew darker as he watched the security footage on a tablet. "Play that section again," Thompson said to the tech staff member beside him. "I want to see exactly when he refused to check her documentation." His voice was calm, but carried an edge of controlled anger. The footage clearly showed Reeves dismissing Sarah's attempts to show her credentials multiple times. Meanwhile, Captain Anderson was making his own documentation. In the pilot's lounge, he filled out a flight delay report, noting exactly how Reeves's actions had impacted the scheduled departure. "Unnecessary delay due to discriminatory behavior by security personnel," he wrote, his usually neat handwriting sharp with irritation. Sarah had reached her plane but paused at the base of the stairs. "I need copies of everything," she said to Jenkins, who had escorted her. "All the footage, all the reports, all the witness statements." Her voice was steady, but there was a new determination in it. This wasn't just about her anymore. Rachel, the flight attendant, was still beside her, no longer holding the coffee but instead her own phone. "I have photos from last week's flight too," she offered. "Shows you boarding through the same terminal, same time, same everything." Sarah nodded gratefully, more evidence of her regular presence here. Back in the terminal, Maria was collecting witness statements one by one. The attorney, Michael Preston, was particularly detailed in his account. "I've seen Ms. Chen Williams here at least a dozen times," he stated as Maria wrote. "There's no way any regular security staff wouldn't know her. This was clearly targeted harassment." The young man who had first recorded the incident, a tech startup employee named Alex Chen, no relation to Sarah, was uploading his video to a secure cloud drive. "I'm sending you the link," he told Maria. "It's high definition and shows everything from the moment she walked in." Thompson had moved on to interviewing the other security guards. Jenkins was explaining how he had actually checked Sarah's documentation, doing the job Reeves had refused to do. "Everything was in order, sir. Everything. There was no reason for any of this." The terminal's legal team had been contacted, and their representative was already on her way. The morning sun was now fully up, creating long shadows across the terminal floor as more regular passengers arrived, looking curiously at the unusual amount of activity. Sarah's pilot's license had become a point of particular interest. "She's not just a passenger," Captain Anderson explained to Thompson. "She understands aviation protocols better than most people in this terminal." The irony of Reeves questioning her belonging in an aviation space when she was literally licensed to fly was not lost on anyone. Maria finished another witness statement and looked at her growing pile of documentation. Each piece of paper, each video file, each photograph was building a clear picture of what had happened. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. "We'll need copies of her previous flight records," Thompson said to his assistant. "Pull everything from the past year." The assistant nodded, already heading to the records office. The documentation was painting a clear picture. Sarah Chen Williams was not just a legitimate client, she was one of their most regular and respected passengers. As Sarah finally began climbing the stairs to her aircraft, the morning sunlight caught her face. Despite everything, she held herself with dignity and grace. Behind her, the terminal was busy with the work of documenting truth that would ensure what happened this morning would lead to real change. The private jet's engines hummed quietly as Sarah settled into her usual seat. Through the window, she could see the terminal building where people were still gathered, their movements reflecting the gravity of what had just happened. Captain Anderson was doing his final checks with a bit more intensity than usual, his normally relaxed demeanor replaced by focused professionalism. Inside the terminal, things were reaching their own resolution. David Thompson, the head of security, had finally finished reviewing all the evidence. He turned to face Thomas Reeves, who stood stiffly near the security desk, his face a mix of defiance and growing fear. "Mr. Reeves," Thompson said, his voice carrying across the now quiet terminal, "turn in your badge and security credentials. You're suspended effective immediately, pending a full investigation." The words fell heavy in the air, making several witnesses pause in their conversations. Reeves's face turned pale. "But sir, I was just trying to maintain security protocols." He started to argue, but Thompson cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Security protocols?" Thompson's voice was controlled but firm. "I've watched the footage 3 times now. You violated at least 7 different protocols yourself. You refused to check valid ID. You escalated a non-existent situation. You dismissed a superior's intervention. You profiled a legitimate client. Should I continue?" Maria Rodriguez stepped forward with a thick folder of freshly gathered evidence. "We have statements from 12 witnesses," she reported, plus video footage from 4 different angles and documentation of Ms. Chen Williams's previous flights. She's flown from this terminal 28 times in the past year alone. The attorney, Michael Preston, who had stayed to give his statement, spoke up from where he stood nearby. "The Aviation Authority will be very interested in this incident," he said. "As will the media, I imagine." His words caused Reeves to sink further into himself, the full impact of his actions finally seeming to hit him. Outside, Sarah's plane was ready for takeoff. Rachel, the flight attendant, served Sarah's perfectly made latte in her favorite cup, the one they kept specially for her on this regular route. Despite the morning's events, Sarah opened her laptop and began reviewing her presentation for the Seattle meeting. Success, she had learned long ago, was the best response to prejudice. Back in the terminal, Jenkins, the young security officer who had done his job properly, was being commended by Thompson. "This is how we handle security," Thompson said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We check credentials, we treat everyone with respect, we follow actual protocols, not our personal biases." The terminal's legal representative had arrived and was quickly briefed on the situation. She looked through the evidence and shook her head. "This is exactly the kind of incident we've been working to prevent," she said. We need systematic changes, not just individual corrections. Maria was already drafting a new training protocol on her computer. Mandatory bias training for all security personnel, she muttered as she typed. Weekly reviews of interaction protocols. Monthly assessments of customer complaints. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, turning this incident into a catalyst for change. Through the terminal's windows, Sarah's plane began to taxi toward the runway. Several of the witnesses watched it go, some still shaking their heads at what they had seen. The morning sun glinted off the plane's windows, creating a brief flash of light, almost like a camera taking one final picture of the scene. Reeves stood alone now, his security badge and credentials sitting on the desk in front of him. The crowd had thinned, but the weight of what had happened hung heavy in the air. He watched as his former colleague Jenkins took up the security post, checking another passenger's credentials with proper attention and respect. As Sarah's plane lifted off into the morning sky, Thompson turned to address his remaining security team. Let this be a lesson, he said firmly. Our job is to ensure safety through proper procedures, not to act on prejudices. From today, things will be different. Maria nodded in agreement as she finished typing. The morning's events had been difficult, but they would lead to necessary changes. In the end, Sarah Chen Williams had done more than just prove Reeves wrong. She had sparked a transformation in how the terminal would operate from this day forward. By late afternoon, Sarah's incident at the private terminal had gone viral. As she finished her successful meeting in Seattle, her phone was buzzing constantly with notifications. The young tech employee's video had been shared thousands of times across social media platforms, and major news networks were trying to get in touch with her for comments. In the office of SecuriNet Solutions PR Director, Jessica Martinez, phones were ringing nonstop. No, we won't be making a statement just yet, she repeated for what felt like the 100th time. Ms. Chen Williams is focused on her business meetings today. She glanced at her computer screen where the video's view count kept climbing. Back at the San Francisco terminal, Maria Rodriguez was in her third meeting of the day. The room was packed with aviation authority representatives, legal teams, and terminal management. The large screen on the wall showed freeze frames from the security footage, each image more damaging than the last. This isn't just about one security guard, said Linda Chen, the Aviation Authority's chief investigator. We need to look at the whole system. She flipped through the thick stack of incident reports on the table. How did someone with these attitudes get hired in the first place? Outside the meeting room, regular terminal operations continued, but there was a noticeable difference. Jenkins, now temporarily in charge of the security team, made sure every passenger's credentials were checked properly, regardless of their appearance. The other security guards followed his lead, their movements more careful and conscious than before. Sarah's story had struck a chord with people across the country. Social media was filled with similar stories from other professionals who had faced discrimination in various settings. #CEO Skalmaluk like this was trending, with thousands sharing their own experiences of being questioned or doubted in professional spaces. In Seattle, Sarah's presentation had been a huge success. As she packed up her materials, her client, the CEO of Tech Forward, approached her. I saw the video, he said quietly. It was posted in our company's internal chat. My entire team is outraged on your behalf. Sarah smiled diplomatically. Sometimes the best response to prejudice is success, she replied, sliding her laptop into its bag. The contract she had just secured was worth twice what she had initially hoped for. Meanwhile, Thomas Reeves sat in his home, watching his face appear on news channels. His phone had been ringing too, old colleagues expressing disappointment, journalists seeking comments, and his union representative trying to discuss his options. His suspension was making headlines. Discriminatory security guard suspended after harassing Tech CEO. Back at the terminal, Maria was implementing immediate changes. New signs were being posted. All passengers must have credentials verified, no exceptions. Training schedules were being revised, and security protocols were being rewritten to explicitly address bias and discrimination. The aviation company's CEO had issued a public statement. We apologize unreservedly to Ms. Chen Williams and are taking immediate steps to ensure such an incident never happens again. We are reviewing all our security procedures and implementing comprehensive anti-bias training across all our terminals. Sarah's team at SecureNet Solutions have been busy too. Her executive assistant, Michael, had organized an emergency board meeting for the next morning. The board wants to discuss using this incident to push for industry-wide changes, he told her over the phone. They think we're in a unique position to influence aviation security protocols. By evening, as Sarah boarded her return flight, the story had evolved. It wasn't just about one incident anymore. It had become a talking point about systemic bias in corporate America. News anchors were discussing it, social media was debating it, and corporate leaders were examining their own company's practices. Captain Anderson, flying Sarah back to San Francisco, shared some news of his own. The Pilots Association is drafting new guidelines, he told her during the flight. We want to make sure we're part of the solution too. As the sun set over the Pacific, Sarah looked out the plane window, thinking about how one morning's incident had sparked such widespread discussion and change. Her phone buzzed again, another news request, another message of support, another sign that what had happened that morning wouldn't be forgotten or ignored. The story had taken on a life of its own, becoming bigger than Sarah or Reeves or the terminal. It had become a catalyst for change, a moment that would be referenced in future training sessions, policy discussions, and conversations about workplace discrimination. 1 month after the incident, Sarah Chen Williams stood at a podium in the same San Francisco private terminal where everything had happened. The space had been transformed for a press conference, with cameras and journalists filling the area where she had once been stopped by Reeves. Today, we're announcing a new partnership, Sarah spoke clearly into the microphones. SecureNet Solutions will be working with major aviation companies to implement new security protocols and training programs across all private terminals in the country. The terminal looked different now. New signs about equal treatment and respect hung on the walls. The security desk had been redesigned to be more open and welcoming. Jenkins, now permanently promoted to head of terminal security, stood professionally at his post, treating each passenger with the same careful respect. Maria Rodriguez sat in the front row, smiling proudly. The changes she had helped implement were working. In the past month, passenger satisfaction scores had actually improved, proving that proper security could be maintained while treating everyone with dignity. What happened to me was not unique, Sarah continued, her voice carrying across the hustle room, but the response has been unique. Instead of just apologizing and moving on, this terminal and its parent company chose to make real, lasting changes. In the audience, several familiar faces from that morning watched. The attorney, Michael Preston, had helped draft new legal guidelines for security procedures. The young tech employee, Alex Chen, had been hired by SecureNet Solutions to help develop training videos using his footage from that day. The changes weren't just local. Private aviation companies across the country had started reviewing their own procedures. Sarah's story had become a case study in corporate training programs, teaching employees about bias and its consequences. Thomas Reeves's story had taken its own turn. After his suspension and subsequent resignation, he had gone through extensive bias training. Now, surprisingly, he was working with a diversity consulting firm, sharing his story as an example of how unconscious bias could blind someone to their own prejudices. The best measure of progress, Sarah said, gesturing to the terminal around her, is that every passenger now gets the same treatment I should have received that day. Every ID is checked properly. Every credential is verified professionally. No assumptions are made based on appearance. The numbers backed up her words. Customer complaints about discriminatory treatment had dropped to 0 in the past month. The terminal's new training program was being adopted by other airports, and their security staff turnover rate had decreased significantly. Captain Anderson, standing near the back of the room, remembered how different things had been just a month ago. Now, he saw his fellow pilots actively participating in anti-bias workshops, learning to speak up when they witnessed discrimination. This isn't just about airports or security, Sarah continued. It's about creating spaces where everyone is treated with the same respect, regardless of how they look or what assumptions others might make about them. Rachel, the flight attendant, had been promoted to customer service trainer. She now taught new staff members how to provide consistent, respectful service to all passengers. Her training sessions often started with the story of that morning, using it to demonstrate both what could go wrong and how to do things right. The press conference concluded with an announcement that made headlines. SecureNet Solutions would be offering their security training program free of charge to any aviation company willing to implement it. It was Sarah's way of turning a negative experience into positive change. As cameras flashed and journalists asked their final questions, Sarah looked around the terminal. She saw diverse faces among the staff, noticed how smoothly security checks were being conducted, and felt satisfied knowing that her experience had led to real transformation. Later that evening, as she boarded her flight to her next meeting, Sarah experienced the new security protocols firsthand. Jenkins checked her ID with the same professional courtesy he showed to every passenger, neither more nor less deferential because of who she was. The sun was setting as her plane took off, casting long shadows across the terminal where everything had started. But now those shadows fell across a changed space, one where dignity, respect, and professionalism had replaced bias and prejudice. Sarah's story had become more than just a viral video or a news headline. It had become a catalyst for lasting change in an industry that needed it.